Were you born in Westminster?
Born and raised.
Were you really?
Yep.
Now, what year were you born?
Born 1971, St. Mary's Hospital.
Really?
Yeah, and I'm 42 years old. My brother was born in New Westminster. I am the first one in my family born in Canada. My sister was born in India and then immigrated here. My dad immigrated to Canada in the mid to late 60s.
From Punjab?
From Punjab. My mom and my sister came to Canada about 3 or 4 years later. So he left a 1.5, 2-year-old in India and hadn't seen her until she was about 5. And so hi, thank you. You really sure you don't want anything? Is that on? Is that working properly?
Let's make sure it is. Yes, it is.
Okay. Do you want me to hold it closer?
Nah, it should be okay.
Okay. So, yeah, it's interesting. This is I have attachment to a lot of things in the city and in the region, and one of the big projects I worked on just outside of New Westminster was Fraser Mills, the rezoning and redevelopment of Fraser Mills, and we did the planning work on that. And my father worked at Fraser Mills when I was born, around the time I was born, and it provided him with a job. And here he was working on the shores of the Fraser River at the time. And
now, ordinarily, we ask people, do you remember your first? With the older ones, do you remember your first view of the Fraser River? Or do you have any recollection of what you first thought of the Fraser River?
I have a lot of early memories of the Fraser River, and there's two that stick out in my mind. Now you brought it up. It would be parking at the Front Street Parkade and looking out over the parkade to the river, and being able to see it from 50, 70 feet up in the air, and having as a child looking out at the Fraser from that viewpoint, and it's a very quiet spot when you're up that high looking at it also. So I remember that, and we'd either be heading to Army and Navy, or we'd be heading to the old, I think it was a discount store for either Kmart or Woolco or something like that, at right across from the Paramount Theater. There's an old discount store that we would shop at also. Those were the two places that we would go to. The other early memory I have was when I was 5 years old. My parents had bought me a 99-cent autograph book from Woodward's as a birthday present, and I took that autograph book with me to the old King Neptune restaurant on the banks of the Fraser River, and it was to go to a rally to meet Pierre Elliott Trudeau. So I got Trudeau saw me in the crowd with some very hardworking blue-collar New Westminster guy with a jean jacket and jeans, who picked me up and held me up in the air, a complete stranger, and I had a pen and autograph book in my hand. So here I was on the banks of the Fraser River at that time, and Trudeau saw me, came up to me, asked me, "What's your name, son?" I told him. Actually, I was first speechless, and then he looked at me again, and the fan who held me said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Gary." And so I got an autograph that says, "To Gary, from Pierre Elliott Trudeau." Put the book back in my hand, got up in a limousine, and then left. So those are my two distinct early memories of the Fraser.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Is that what you're looking for?
That's exactly what I was looking for.
Okay.
We had wondered if people remembered any, being an American, we have those moments of, do you remember where you were when Kennedy was shot, when 9/11 occurred? And we had asked several people, do you have any memories of dignitaries visiting or things like that? And you're the first person who actually, I've never heard anybody say they remembered Pierre Trudeau coming to town. You're the first person who said anything like that.
Well, it's a town that bleeds orange and black.
Yeah, that's
and three other letters that kind of sound like NDP. So a memory of Pierre Elliott Trudeau is not something that may be seen as favorable from the 70s, right?
I remember, being an American, I remember Pierre Trudeau's
Sure.
when he left office and he read from the Desiderata.
Oh.
I remember him saying, and no doubt the universe is unfolding as it should.
Yeah.
I thought that was so hippie, you know,
yeah, it was.
so new age.
Politics aside, he really was a microcosm of what social culture was at that time, social and pop culture. So
maybe why I'm here today.
Yeah.
It really stuck with me. Or Margaret smoking dope in the White House.
Yeah. Hey, why not? Everybody else was at that time. Why not?
Do you remember the address of the house that you came home to?
Yep. It was in Brow of the Hill. It was just off of 3rd Street. It was 311 Llewellyn Street.
Really? And did it have a culture? That neighborhood, did it have a particular culture?
It was low income part of New Westminster, probably 4 or 5 blocks from the Fraser River. My dad used to park his dump truck near the house, but he would go work on it in a truck lot on an old industrial site.
So what
near
was your dad's job?
My dad was a dump truck driver.
Really?
Yeah, so he started working at Fraser Mills, which was on the shores of the Fraser River, and then became a dump truck driver. So he would work on his truck. Some other memories would be, heading down to a couple of blocks away from the river, down 3rd Avenue, in the Brow of the Hill neighborhood, into industrial area, and he would go work on his truck. And my brother and I would play on the train tracks and look out at the river. So those early memories of those first 10 years, where I have this romantic memory of this beautiful, majestic, powerful river, and being a small kid and looking at this expanse of a working river, which to me looked and felt like an ocean at that time. Staring at it from the Front Street Parkade, to having this moment of history and meeting the Prime Minister on the shores of the Fraser River was another distinct memory. And then on the flip side, we take sort of the romance and the destination placemaking out of it. It's a hard-working river. It was an industrial river. So my dad working on his truck in an industrial lot on the shores of the Fraser River is another memory I have of it, of the working river and the industrial roots that it has.
Yeah, as you may have seen in the link that I sent you, that is kind of the study angle, is what kind of work occurs along the riverfront. And in the older participants in the study, it definitely has a blue-collar feel to it. And when you see some of the pictures from back in the era, like on the wharf where you spoke at the river market, that was a cannery, that was an ice house. Those buildings don't stand anymore, and now that's not what's standing there. Was your first impression of it as a blue-collar workplace?
It always coincides. So, I don't have one impression of the river. It would be the romance of the river and watching this mighty waterway that just feels like it cleanses the city, right? It sort of washes away everything in the city. And when you're growing up as a poor kid in a blue-collar family in a hardworking, diverse town at that time, New Westminster, really felt like a town at that time, and you look for escape in your hometown. So in some ways it became that tide that sort of cleansed the city, cleansed sins, it cleansed hard feelings. It was just something you could go out and stare at and watch quietly as a tide rushed by. That's would be my early impression of it. And then also tied to it is tugboats, rails, trucks, and watching the hardworking nature of the river and the hardworking people in the city. So it's interesting because when you look at the personality of New Westminster is known as a hardworking blue-collar town, a blue-collar city, and you look at the way that it's physically manifested and represented in the Fraser River, as a hardworking river. It's the two took on each other's personalities in a way, when you think of it that way, right? So, so I have that memory of it.
Were you ever tempted to work on the river yourself?
You know, I worked for the Downtown New Westminster Business Improvement Association as a student, and I always took my holidays out on the, my holidays. I always took my lunch breaks, and it felt like it was a holiday when we were heading out onto the river. And so I would go up on the Front Street Parkade and just sit there and watch the tide roll in and out. I would go down to the now River Market and have lunch and just sit on the banks of the river. A friend of mine who works here used to work at the boathouse, and that was our spot to go as friends, and everybody would want to sit over by the window and just watching the river. It is synonymous with the community in so many ways. So that's something that always became of sort of my early memories when we lived on the, like I referred to on my Petra Kucha speech, was the Manhattan side of the river, right, which is the uptown. So most of my time was spent in Queensborough. We just lived on the Hamilton side of the Queensborough area, but I went to school in New Westminster. I played soccer in New Westminster. I volunteered in New Westminster, and was at the Queensborough Recreational Center almost every day in the summer. Would fish in the Fraser River. So when we moved on to this little farmland in the Queensborough Hamilton area, the relationship and attachment I had to the river was transcended to a whole other level, because we were so close to the river and we were on both sides of it. And our property almost backed out onto the North Fraser. So we could actually walk through the back of our property, and we would go through a bunch of forest, and we saw these wooden rail tracks with some sawhorses and these little wooden cars where people were either taking, it looked like it was a remnant from somebody looking for gold in the river. So we uncovered this on a little excursion one day. So I have this historical memory of it. But I would say the biggest memory I have of the Fraser would be as a teenager in Queensborough, Hamilton area, and either going for a walk or running along Dyke Road. And that would along the South Fraser. And I grew up a big Bruce Springsteen fan. And being a teenager in a blue-collar family, in a blue-collar city, and struggling to get by with an education, and watching your parents doing everything they can and busting their backs to provide for their children, you can't help but wonder, even as a teenager, what's going to happen with your life. So I haven't told many people this, but it was the personal attachment I had to the river, is that it became a point of reflection and contemplation for my own life. And I would go running along there when I would be training for soccer a few times a week. And there was a rock that I would sit at that is still there 30 years later, that I would stop at and take a break and look out at the river and watch the tide roll in and out. And I would listen to Bruce Springsteen songs on my old Walkman, and one of them being Jersey Girl. And I felt like Queensborough was New Jersey, and you could look back over the east side of the river over onto the Manhattan side, and it was a big deal leaving Jersey to get over to Manhattan and having to take that bridge, so you really felt you were isolated. But I had this personal attachment to the river, sitting on this rock, and I still go back every once in a while to check it out. I haven't been there in probably 6 months, maybe since last summer, but I do go there on average about once a year, just to go for a bit of a stroll on my own and contemplate my life and where I'm at. And even at that point in my life, when I would sit there, all I wanted was a car and a girl, and to get out of Queensborough and to make something of my life. And like every other Bruce Springsteen song you ever heard. And what I didn't know is that when I had finished university, finished graduate school, and started working in the land development industry, where was one of my first big projects? It was in my hometown. And so there's this point of reflection, a physical point of reflection that is along the banks of the Fraser River that I still go to. And so when people ask me about what is your story about the Fraser, it's personal for me. That's what it is.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
A big part of this, unintentionally, has turned out to be about parents and their children. When you think about your childhood and you think about your parents, what do you think they wanted? Maybe you don't have to wonder. What did they want you to be when you grew up? What do you think they wanted you to be when you grew up?
With no disrespect to my parents, I think my parents wanted me, my brother, and my sister to not have the life they did. You know, to not be struggling to get by paycheck to paycheck. They saw a land of opportunity when they came here from India, and they saw something that it could give to us. My parents don't complain about their life. You know, they're very hardworking people, and they consider themselves being very fortunate with what they've been able to provide us. So they would have wanted us to get an education. They would have wanted us to make a living. They would have wanted us to be good and true to our family. And they would have wanted us to give back to a community that had been good to them. They might not always, it wasn't always necessarily good to them, you know, being an Indian family in the 70s and 80s, and it wasn't always good to me, but we refused to dwell on the fact that the color of our skin, the food that we ate, the language that we spoke, our religious background, and that a small select group of people saw that as a target, that it would ever affect our lives. So they aspired for us to have great things in our life, largely centered around a premise of having a strong education first. Strong education and great family values. And so there's no other way to accomplish something like that when you're a tight family growing up on some farmland and growing your own food to eat, because it's just enough to get by on the banks of the mighty Fraser River. So think about all the other hardworking families in New Westminster. They either had a personal relationship or a working relationship with the river. And it is this amazing piece of geology and geography and topography that to me is the backbone, the physical backbone of New Westminster. And yeah, it's the spine of the city, and it is always there, and it's provided so much to so many people, but they don't necessarily realize it, and it becomes this physical manifestation of the people of the city itself. So there is strength in the mighty Fraser. There's an ethic in the mighty Fraser. There's a romance in the mighty Fraser. There is hope that comes out of the Fraser River. It is a tide that in a river that washes in and out, day in, day out, and something just majestic about it. And it's alive, right? And it's different every day. And it is, if people could just take a moment to reflect what that river means to them and means to their community.
What's your favorite season on the
My favorite season?
on the Fraser?
Summer.
Is it?
Yeah. Be hot nights in July or August when my brother and I would go fishing in the river. Wouldn't catch too much other than sturgeon, which we had to throw back. And we had some friends that lived on houseboats on the Fraser as well. So during the summer, we'd spend a lot of time there. We built the most incredible tree fort ever between grade 6 and 7 on the banks of the Fraser and a little on the other side of the Dyke Road.
Oh, really? Tell me about
That was not and we took all these remnants and scraps of wood. There was five of us that built this, 3 floors. It was built in between 2 massive trees. We had a pulley that we constructed, pulled in a coal-burning stove onto the second floor, made it waterproof, and constructed over an entire summer, over 3 floors. And the top 2 would overlook the Fraser River.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So every day we were there.
Oh, is this a harbinger of your future career, perhaps?
Yeah, I never thought of it that way.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I wish I had pictures of it. Still kind of go around looking for it. Unfortunately, it got destroyed by some bullies in September, but we were able to enjoy it for an entire summer. And here we were, kids in grade 5, 6, and 7. 5 of us that built this structure. Incredible. I can't believe we actually did it. It's probably stronger construction than some of the things I worked on today.
One of the themes throughout this has been, I have to touch on societal themes like, unfortunately, racism, gender issues. What can we say about the way society has changed? You touched on bullying. What do you remember about your first day of school, your early elementary school experiences? Sure. When did you first sense that there was something different? I mean, your parents valued education.
Sure.
You must have been excited about going to school.
Yeah. Well, school for me was different. You know, I've talked about this wonderful attachment that I've got to the Fraser River and this romantic love affair that I have with the city that I grew up in. But it wasn't always that way. You know, I was racially bullied when I was in elementary school. It began a little bit around kindergarten. I've got a scar on my upper lip that has been there since I was about 5, and on the tip of my nose, which is all sewn back together because I was hit in the face with a brick and it busted open my face. So that was hard as a 5-year-old to understand why that happened.
Any specific incident?
Oh yeah, no, I remember. There was me and my 2 cousins, and it was one of the kids from up the street that really took issue with us for some reason being brown kids, and he picked up a brick and entirely racially motivated and bullying and threw it. And I was the youngest one of the bunch, and it hit me in the face. I remember the impact. It was jarring. I saw black. It was like the curtains closed on my eyes. Stars ringing. I remember, the next thing I remember was being in the hospital with my uncle and my mom, getting my face all stitched up.
Do you remember, were there repercussions for the assailant?
No, none. None at all to him. And so, you know, that's the first incident where I could figure out that I probably looked different or sounded different or my family was different. I still didn't understand it. And then went to John Robson School, and in kindergarten it was okay. Grade 1 it really began, and by the time it was in grade 3, it felt like it was daily ritual beatings, emotional torment. I was in grade 3. I was put in a grade 4 class, but they still taught me grade 3. And some of the older kids that were there had been bothering me for quite some time. I haven't really opened up about it until recently. There was, a few incidents. I remember having chicken pox and leaving class for a week, coming back and just hoping that maybe the kids missed me, the ones that had been bullying me. Maybe things would change. And I came back, and the kids that had been bullying me led a chorus of boos as I walked back into class. And that one was probably the most hurtful. It was more hurtful than the physical beatings. Punched the Hindu in the windbag. Just people punching me in the stomach at recess. I didn't even understand why they were calling me Hindu, because I was Punjabi and I didn't know it was a racist term to refer to me. And I remember another incident where my brother and I were walking out of class, and I always remember he was a year younger than me, to ensure that we were okay, and we walked home from school together. And there were 2 black girls, one in my class and one in his class, that were getting beaten up. And so some of these kids that were bullying me were much older, right? One of them was in grade 8, and some of them were a few years older. And they were beating up these 2 black girls and calling them terrible names, just absolute terrible names to these 2 young girls. And they were crying. And can you imagine being 9 or 10 years old, watching a friend of yours, just because of the color of her skin, getting kicked in the face by 14-year-olds and 12-year-olds? And so it happened to be one of the days that my dad one of the 2 or 3 days that my dad would get off work early and was picking us up from school. And I heard the clop of his work boots coming down the asphalt. And he ran after the boys that were doing this, stopped, came back, looked at the 2 girls, yelled at the teacher for not stopping it, which in her defense, some of these kids were quite big, and I don't think she was yelling stop it, but she couldn't physically get involved. My dad looked at me and said, "They're doing this to you too, aren't they?" And I said, "Yeah, they are." And I remember him looking at me with this look of disgust and anger and shaking his head. So, the impact that those early years at that school had on my life, it still affects me today. I have a strong defense mechanism when it comes to bullying. I look at it as reflective of how the city was at that time, a tough town. And it's after grade 3, I started grade 4 at our other school. And, one of the toughest boys the toughest boy in that school was in grade 7 at that time. And he befriended me and my brother right away. And I really didn't know what it was going to be like being in this new school. And I'll never forget Raminder telling me when I asked him about what it was like in the school. And he looked at me and said, "No one's going to bother you." He actually said, I think his exact words were, "You stick with me, no one's going to bother you." And he made sure that we were looked after. He also made sure we defended ourselves too, And so we still stay friends to this day. We were reunited probably around the time my son was born, about 7 years ago. I ran into him at Canada Games Pool when I was working out there, and I saw him again working security at BC Place. He was working as a bylaw officer for the city of New Westminster. Still protecting people. So I went up to him a couple years ago, and I told him the impact that he had on my life when I started at school.
That must have felt so good.
Yeah, he was shocked and had no idea. But he remembers the incidents, and he remembers looking out for us. And we still remain friends to this day, and he was my protector and a real unsung hero in New Westminster.
Was that a predominantly Caucasian school, and he had just already fought the battle?
Yeah, I would say he was a few years older, and there were 1, 2, 3, 4 Indian families. 5 Indian families were in that school, but it was such a small school that he made sure that that nothing ever happened. But what it did was,
did you sense that society was also changing along with?
Yeah,
I mean, that
just it
was becoming unacceptable, that racism was becoming out of fashion, if you will?
Yeah, I think it was, there was this overt racism that my parents' generation went through, and there was this more passive racism that people would feel it and say things and do things. It did come up again when I was in high school, in the first early years that I was there in grade 8 and grade 9. But it really started to pass at that time. That was probably in the early, mid-'80s. And there's a real cultural, societal shift that had to happen where it was unacceptable to speak to people in a racist way.
Did you find that your own superior performance sometimes shut people up? I mean, you do seem like an extraordinary person.
Well, I think being bullied in school has put a really strong defense mechanism in me of wanting to overperform and overstudy and overachieve, and it still affects me to this day.
I'll show them.
Yeah, exactly. I probably wouldn't be able to do it physically, but I could do it in other ways.
Right.
So, I buried my nose in books and I studied a lot, so I did do a lot of that. But I wouldn't.
What would you like to see for your own child? You're a father now yourself.
Yeah, so I have this memory of my son. We were in a doctor's office about 2 years ago, and a year and a half ago, and we sat down, and he says to me in a awkwardly quiet doctor's office, like everyone's quiet, and he says to me, "Dad, that man over there has black skin." And then he referred to someone else's hair. I think she has orange hair. I think she had orange and blue hair, actually. And he said, "That person's skin is white. Our skin is brown, Dad." And I looked at him and said, "Yeah, And he said, isn't it cool that we can just all look so different? And I looked over at the man that he referred to, and he looked at me and smiled and just nodded his head. And it meant so much to me that my son doesn't see people by the color of their skin, of their hair, or what they're wearing. And to him, he's just excited to be around other people, and we can look different or sound different, and it's just, and it's something, yeah, and it's something that just should be celebrated. So, yeah, so he doesn't see the world in that way, and I refuse to let him see the world in that way. I think he can be proud of our family's heritage. I think he can, in terms of being from India, and he understands that. He can be proud of my family's roots and growing up in New Westminster, and why it's this very special place to me. And but being proud of that and celebrating it is a part of living in a diverse region that we are right now. So I would hope that the values that he is learning in his generation means that never again will someone be judged by the color of their skin or their orientation or their belief system. That is something that is just celebrated and accepted regardless of who you are. That would be my wish for him.
When you look ahead 20, 30 years, what do you imagine that same waterfront will look like?
I think the tide will still roll in and out like it always has. Like a pendulum clock that is always there, swinging, like Father Time that continues to moving forward. The edges and the periphery will change here and there. There could be things that are built along the river. There could be new people living along the river. There could be new industry that happens along the river. So I think change and renewal of the shore is okay. I think it's exciting, and I think if the edges of the river continues to stay relevant to that societal that societal group or the aspiration of the city at that moment, I'm okay if that changes. But the constant for me will always be the watercourse in the river, which will always be there. So do I see the edges and the periphery of it changing and updating and being relevant to the people who have an attachment at the river? Absolutely. You know, that type of change, as long as it is within the cultural and social aspirations of the city and the people that live there, go for it. But the core of the river would always stay the same. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I have a conflict that keeps coming up among the interviewees, which has to do with the natural resources and the exploitation of natural resources. Can people make a decent living along the waterfront in careers that don't exploit the natural resources? How can they have decent river?
Yeah, well, you know, there's when you look at the river as a transportation corridor, there's a role that it has. And some of that would be the movement of goods and cargo and resources. Renewing the resource within the river, like the fish stock, is something that would have to continue. And I do think we've done a good job of it. It's monitored. We've done the best that we can. We only get criticized when we haven't been able to do it. But I think we have some amazing stewards of the river that I hope would continue looking after that. I think the edges of the river and the habitat that is required in order to maintain the physical health of the river should remain, and we've done a pretty good job of trying to keep that. Just on the outside of that, if there's other things that can be done, whether it's allowing people to live there, whether it's pathways, or whether it's new homes or new shops, that kind of stuff only allows people to have some access to the river. People want to be there. Yes, it should be protected, but it also needs to be accessible. And it needs to be accessible in ways that are also fun for people. You can't tell me that the boardwalk that was constructed along the quay and the river market that is there and the boathouse restaurant that is there are not positive additions to the river. They are. For the personal touch and feel that people want to have on the river, and I think it's perfectly fine to have those things, as long as it doesn't impact the long-term physical health of the river I'm okay with that.
Have you been involved, and I'm a very new resident of the area, have you been involved in the discussion about the coal transportation of coal?
No, I haven't. And my concern with that would be it only takes one negative impact, one detrimental, catastrophic event to happen to ruin the river. And I've seen this in other locations in BC, particularly with coal slack. And it's a, unfortunately, it is very important to our economy, but if the risk is not mitigated, it is a black cancer that would grow in the river. And I've seen it. Ladysmith is a good example, actually. If you look at the coal slack that was washed there decades ago, along the banks of Ladysmith, is still there, right? It's still there. That would be, I would have a real personal hang-up about something like that.
The last discussion I saw was that the Surrey Docks folks said we had a study, and they said there were no health risks, and the opposite camp said that was a pretty lame study.
Well, of course they say there's no health risk, and they're not.
But they said they weren't planning on covering the boats or anything. They were just going to
it's
bring on the coal.
It's the easiest way to. I used to work for the Port Authority, so I would know. It's the easiest way for them to transport the coal is just as open bulk cargo.
That doesn't sound good.
No, but if you look at the way that other goods have been moved, it's either containerized or, which probably might not work for coal because they have so much of it to move. Hey, dump trucks on our street. My dad's a dump truck driver. Those had to be covered when they were driving on streets because of health impact. And you can't tell me that a resource like that, we should not mitigate the risk in order to protect our other resource. So, unfortunately, and I'll say this for the record, I'm not there yet, and I don't buy that the impacts can't be mitigated.
Yeah, you think of some of the bad weather days that we've had on the river. You imagine barges full of coal coming down with the wind.
I can tell you this: we never expected. If you thought 10 years ago that a BC Ferries was going to sink and that people would die, you would say, forget it. Why should we mitigate that risk? The ferries are safe. But it happened once. If we said that the pipeline that a lot of people didn't know existed in Burnaby was going to be ruptured and we'd have a massive oil leak into our natural resource. Have you said it to you 10 years ago that it could happen? People would say no, wouldn't have thought of it. Unfortunately, knock on wood, it could also happen when an earthquake hits Vancouver. It would be the same thing with a potential coal disaster. I would say, in the lifetime of the river, it will happen, right? It will happen at some point. There will be an accident with that. How do you mitigate that risk? Instead of saying that the way that we transport it is safe, you need to plan if that thing is turned over or partially capsized or something. How would you protect that coal from harming one of our province's most amazing resources? And I'm probably speaking, hopefully I'm speaking as much rationally as I am emotion, because I think both of them are involved. I think you need to plan that it does happen, and how would you mitigate it? Certainly don't think we should be standing in the way of economic development, but we need to be convinced that the disaster has been mitigated. I don't think they're there yet. Okay.
I think we've really eaten into your schedule,
How's that?
so I don't want to...
Is that okay?
That was...
I could talk forever.
I could listen to you forever.
Okay.
I really could, but I know that you have to get back to the office.
We could do it on the phone if you wanted to record on the phone moving forward.
Yeah, I may end up begging you for more time, but I know you have to get back to the office, and you've done just an awesome job. Is there anybody else that you think we should talk to regarding the river?
Have you talked to the Fraser River Discovery Center?
I think one of the other people is. This is in conjunction with the museum, and I know that they work with the Discovery Center, and And some of these questions were about businesses on the river, and so I don't think I have to ask you about your particular work and whether or not you have a union or safety issues.
No.
Do you feel that the waterfront contributed to your masculine or feminine identity?
I would say it absolutely helped shape me, and it is. And if you take three things out of it, one would be being up on the Front Street Parkade and looking out at the river and being struck by its awe and its beauty, and this physical and emotional attachment I had to my hometown. That's one. Number two would be the interest I had in democracy and the public system after meeting Pierre Trudeau there as a 5-year-old, and becoming either politically or socially or community involved in my community as a result of that. Certainly that's happened. The roots of my family and working along the river and understanding what it meant to my family from that perspective would be the third one. And the fourth one would be how the river would tug on my heartstrings when I would sit on that rock, listening to Bruce Springsteen songs, taking a break from my run, and contemplating my life that I did as a teenager, that I still make a point of going out to today. If that was the only thing that you took out of this interview to understand my emotional and physical connection to the river, that would be it.
That would be fantastic. I really thank you so much for your time. That was absolutely beautiful. And I know you have to get back to work, but I really can't thank you enough.
You don't have to thank me. I'm humbled and flattered that you would actually think that I have a story to tell about my life that would be important to you.
I have many stories to tell, but I will stop here for this one.